Introduction to Barrier to the Sky 2. Transcending reincarnation and traveling through various realms. The leader of the slaughtering god, with one sword shattering the sky. As the saying goes, thousands of heroes fight each other, the lords of the heavens are all making soil, a close friend blushes in fleeting years, the supreme temple's precious light appears. Multiverse, soared the world. Chapter 1. Task Start. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Speaking of Lin Shi's story. Transcendent reincarnation, traveling through various realms. Tu Shen leader, with one sword shattering the sky. Yu Dao is. Thousands of heroes fight each other's battles, the lords of the heavens have turned into soil, a confidant blushes in fleeting years, the supreme temple's precious light appears. Multiverse, wield your sword to conquer the world. The old man spat and said, while a young man next to him listened with his dark eyes open. He couldn't help but say, it doesn't sound like Lin Shi at all. It feels like a story about a great hero. At least Lin Shi, whom I know, is not like that. He is quite easygoing. Cough, the old man coughed a few times while covering his mouth with his fist. Then why do you still insist on listening to my husband's story in the multiverse? Why don't you just kill him? Hey hee, the young man chuckled while holding his cheeks in both hands, isn't this to gain more information about him? You tell me, let me hear what kind of hero technique he is. The old man blinked his eyes and looked at the mountains in the distance, saying, the story begins with Lin Shi defeating the demon slayer Yu Zhulong with a move of one sword slash, dawn, and making a vow of companionship with Zhou Tianxin until eternity. At this point, Lin Shi didn't even know that he had been targeted by the demon slayer and the egg royal family, and was still leisurely waiting for news from Gua Wanlong in the hotel. The young man straightened up with a trembling smile and said, Guahaha Bandung, are you laughing? The old man smacked his mouth and said, Gua Wanlong is a mature woman with a delicate and curvaceous figure. Her figure is. Her three sides. Cough, don't interrupt me. The young man placed his arms on the table and smiled, keep going. In a small wooden hotel, a young man lay on the bed with his hands resting on his pillow, his eyes sparkling as he looked at the ceiling, pondering the information he had learned from Yu Zhulong's memory. Demon Slayer. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but the name of this organization actually corresponds to the name of his game guild God Slayer, and the incredibly powerful Yu Zhulong is just an ordinary member of the Demon Slayer. It can be imagined how powerful the Demon Slayer is. The young man with lingering palpitations in his heart is naturally the old man's name Lin Shi. Of course, it's not time to consider this matter yet. The 24-hour agreement with Guadalcanal is already very close, and Lin Shi said in his mind, crazy, check my equipment. Shao Kuang is a super system within Lin Shi's body. In the multiverse, almost everyone has a super system, otherwise it would be difficult to move forward. The origin of Shao Kuang is somewhat complex. It is not a super system sold on the multiverse market, but a system brought by Lin Shi from the native plane, created by a system genius. After multiple upgrades, today's Shao Kuang can finally keep up with the strength of the multiverse super system. The native plane, on the other hand, is the plane that Lin Shi was born into. Usually, humans who break boundaries and come to the multiverse have special emotions and connections with their native plane. Shao Kuang said, Master, you only have 2 pieces of equipment, and the Ni Yuan sword is your main weapon. After evolution, it has stronger power and can compete with 3rd grade and above artifacts. Now it is in good condition and can fight at any time. In Lin Shi's perception, a dark green long sword slowly rotated. This jade sword was called Ni Yuan sword, which used to be a short sword, but after upgrading and evolution, it has now become a long sword with even more powerful power. Its performance in previous battles against Yu Zhulong and another strong enemy can be described as 82 points. Then a tattered armor slowly spun and appeared in Lin Shi's mind. Shao Kuang said, not breaking armor is your armor, but it is still in the process of recovery. It will take more than a year for your beginner Dayuan's cultivation to recover it to be usable. Lin Shi said, so it seems that I won't need it for this mission, which means I only have one sword to complete this dangerous task. Xiao Kuang said, you still have me, master. Lin Shi said, however, I never use super system combat. Xiao Kuang couldn't help but say, but at a critical moment, I can save your life. Anyway, everyone in the multiverse is using it. Lin Shi smiled lightly and said, when I need you, I will call you. After speaking in his mind, he jumped out of bed and walked towards the door. Time was almost up, there was only one sword left. Ni Yuanjian had been with him for many years, just like a comrade fighting side by side, enough. As soon as I opened the door, I saw a young girl standing outside, with a pair of water-like big eyes that made people feel like they wanted to eat at just one glance. However, Lin Shi said, Shi Rushuang, what are you doing? The girl named Shi Rushuang said, don't you have any memory? It's time to take action. Lin Shi said, after some consideration, I think it's better for you to stay here and not follow along. Haha. Shi Rushuang couldn't help but stomp her feet and say, you still dislike me for only having high-level cultivation, right? So why are you refining daggers for me? I'm not, I'm going. I'm going. Lin Shiduan was all over with excitement and goosebumps, saying, you. When did you learn to be coquettish? Shi Rushuang took his hand and said, let's go. The two of them went downstairs and saw many strong men with blonde hair and brown hair drinking in the hotel. Lin Shi found a chair and sat down. The strong man on the bar, with his long and thick arms, moved and a glass of beer frothed as he slid over. As soon as Lin Shi lifted his glass, he heard a young man nearby say, are you Lin Shi? Lin Shi turned his head to look at the young man and noticed that he was maintaining the posture of drinking heavily, playing with the glass in his hand. Lin Shi then took a sip from the raised glass and said, not bad. The young man put down his cup and said, great, Gua always has something to attend to. Let me take you on this task. Lin Shi and Shi Rushuang exchanged a glance and said, do you have any proof? The young man turned his head and glanced at him with an idiot's gaze, lazily saying, you don't have to use it if you don't believe it, but that 1,000 life points. Cough cough, Lin Shi said, okay, no problem. Let's go, ha ha ha. Shi Rushuang quietly pulled his sleeve and shouted in a low voice, fool, at least you have defeated the person who killed the general. You need to have momentum, momentum. Lin Shi made a gesture with her arms and legs open and said, how about this? Do you have any momentum? Shi Rushuang immediately raised her hand and wiped her face. Later, the two of them followed the young man as he left the hotel. The young man said, my name is Chao Yang, but when carrying out the mission, it's best for you to call me Louis. Shi Rushuang couldn't help but say, this guy's Chinese name is quite normal. Why does Gua Wanlong call him Gua Wanlong? Ah hee hee. Ah no, I just want to laugh when I think about it. Pop. The young man suddenly patted the table and said, I knew it wasn't just me, a normal person. The old man spat and said, don't interrupt. Upon hearing these words, Chao Yang couldn't help but frown and say, who is this woman? How dare she be rude to us, Mr. Gua? Lin Shi smiled and said, she didn't mean to make fun of Mr. Gua, she just thought his name was strange. Humph. Chao Yang said coldly, how could Mr. Gua ask you to do this task? He just sent you to die. Humph. Shi Rushuang crossed her waist and said, I'll show you clearly. I'm a super strong person who reaches the pinnacle of advanced reading. After speaking, a bright pink aura burst out all over her body, causing nearby dust and beasts to tremble. Chao Yang glanced at Shi Rushuang a few times and turned his head expressionlessly to Lin Shi, saying, why don't you kill her? Our safety factor will be much higher when we carry out the mission. You. Shi Rushuang suddenly grabbed Lin Shi's hand in anger. Lin Shi grabbed the back of his head and said, well, actually she is a professional mind power assassin. Maybe she will help us. Chao Yang shook his head and said, you don't even know what we're going to do next. Lin Shi thought for a moment and said, who made you not tell us at first? Chao Yang walked forward and pointed his nose at Lin Shi's nose, staring into his eyes and saying, General Gua has been preparing for this mission for a long time, and there is no room for any mishap. So I asked you to kill this woman now. You are the source, and you can resurrect her after the mission is over. Upon hearing this, Lin Shi turned his head to look at Shi Ruoxuan and walked towards her step by step. Shi Ruoxuan burst into tears and said, Are you really going to kill me? Wu, I know you will resurrect me later, but I can really help, and being killed must be very painful. At this moment, Lin Shi walked up to her and silently raised his arm, while Shi Ruoxuan finally showed a look of despair. Then, he saw Lin Shi take a moth from her shoulder and say, this is a kind of wizard in the magic world. It seems that a magician has already targeted us. The mission has already begun. He turned around and looked at Chao Yang. Chao Yang couldn't help but say, are you not afraid of mission failure with this burden on you? Burden? No, Lin Shi said with a slight smile, she's my companion. Chapter 2. Objectives. Magic Family. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chao Yang stared at Lin Shi for a while before nodding and saying, just a source, how dare you act so recklessly. Okay, great. So I'll tell you in advance, if you're in danger, don't rely on me. Lin Shi smiled and said, don't worry, we will complete the task. Chao Yang couldn't help but pout and walked out of the market first. Shi Ruoxuan lowered her head and whispered, if I had known earlier, I wouldn't have come. Lin Shi said, don't worry, this may be a good opportunity to improve your combat effectiveness. Let's not miss it. Let's go and keep up. Shi Ruoxuan blushed slightly, nodded, and quickly followed Lin Shi out of the market. Meanwhile, in an unknown room. There are 2 wooden tables in the room, and the walls around them are somewhat dark. Candlelight lights flicker, making the entire room dim. On the 2 circular tables, 6 basketball-sized beads are placed, each displaying a different image. One of the beads emits a purple electric spark, seemingly malfunctioning. A young man in a long robe standing in front of the bead said with a gloomy face, what's going on? What's the origin of this Easterner? He dares to strangle our demon. Does he not take our Stephen family seriously? Dad. A nearby elderly man with white hair and hands on his back said, don't worry, young master. Outsiders like this who suddenly appear in our family's territory often have them. Perhaps this person has seen moths bewitching before, and these people should leave after landing. The young man in the robe said, that's not necessarily true. What if these people are here for our Stephen family? The old man with negative hand said, young master, 2 of these 3 people don't even have basic magic, so it's impossible for them to confront our family. On the contrary, now you should pay attention to the 5 visitors from the blue family who have come from afar. They are clearly well prepared. Of course I know this, said the young man in the robe. Now we will send out even smaller demons. I must grasp the movements of these 3 guys. The old man with negative hands said, yes, sir. Since you are so serious, why don't we test the strength of these 3 people? The young man in the robe shook his head and said, if the test exposes us instead, if you want to beat us, just kill us. And don't let the people of the Brew family notice. The old man with a negative hand said expressionlessly, yes, young master. More than 10 minutes later. Near the market, Shi Ruoxuan couldn't help but say, who are we waiting for? Chao Yang said, you have no right to know. Lin Shi said, after I killed the demon, the other party has not responded yet, which is not very scientific. Chao Yang pursed his lips and said, what science are you talking to the magician about? And from now on, it's best not to kill other people's devils anymore, as it's very likely to scare the grass and the snake. Lin Shi couldn't help but spit out his tongue and smiled, I'm sorry, it seems like this is really the case. Chao Yang couldn't help but be taken aback at the words. He turned his head and saw 3 people wearing cloaks slowly walking through the yellow sand. Chao Yang couldn't help but say, damn it. Look at what you've done. Retreat. Oh no, these 3 should be the people we need to wait for. With a pop sound, a small stone had already been embedded in Lin Shi's chest. Lin Shi pointed to the stone and said, are you sure they are the people we need to wait for? These 3 cloaked people each had a very burly figure, half a height higher than the other 2. One of the other 2 had a graceful figure, probably a woman, while the other had a snow-white goatee, probably an old man. These 3 people saw the stone embedded in Lin Shi's chest, but Lin Shi was fine and couldn't help but stop at the same time. Chao Yang clenched his fists and said, it's all his own people, don't take any action. At this moment, the burly cloaked man said, what are you people? What are you doing here? Is there anyone else who wants to come here too? Upon hearing this, Chao Yang was stunned for a second before suddenly lifting his hand and spraying out a circle of blue magic, enveloping Lin Shi and Shi Rushuang. Then, the surrounding space fluctuated under the influence of this circle of blue magic. Humph! The cloaked woman among the other 3 suddenly sneered, and Chao Yang shouted, ah, and covered his arm. The blue magic circle also dissipated with it. Damn it! Chao Yang cursed loudly, and suddenly a dazzling green light shot out from all over his body, roaring towards the distance. The old man in the cloak said indifferently, I'll go. With that, it turned into a purple light chasing after him. The radiance of the 2 disappeared into the sky in an instant. The burly cloaked man and cloaked woman continued to walk towards Lin Shi and the others. Lin Shi said, are you the masters of the moth demon? I accidentally killed that demon while passing by here. Please don't blame me. The burly cloaked man and cloaked woman still slowly walked towards them, as if they were not worried that their prey would escape. After thinking for a moment, Lin Shi said again, well, it's not easy to cultivate. Why don't we sit down and chat and turn our swords into jade? Hey hee, the cloaked woman said, I'll leave this body refining to you. The burly cloaked man clenched his fist and said, humph, I'm so happy about it. Lin Shi suddenly pointed in a direction and shouted, I'm going. There's a cannon. However, the 2 cloaked men remained unmoved and instead continued walking with a sneer. Lin Shi opened his hand and said, okay then. Before they could finish speaking, the 2 suddenly disappeared into place. Ha! The cloaked woman was momentarily taken aback and said, cross-border teleportation. At the same time, Chao Yang, who was being chased in the distance, instantly disappeared into the air. The old man in the cloak flew to the spot where he had disappeared and said, surprisingly, he was allowed to run away. What about you? The cloaked woman said slowly, we're the same. It seems like we've had quite a few impressive guests this time, humph. Meanwhile, in an unknown plane. Chao Yang examined his body and said, I hate you guys who jump back and forth the most. You don't even know how to appreciate the scenery along the way. Originally, just as the 2 sides were about to start fighting, Lin Shi used crossover teleportation, which was not unique to the original player. However, it was indeed very fast to be used by the original player, and it was usually difficult for opponents to interrupt. Lin Shi and Shi Rushuang, who were standing nearby, exchanged a glance and said, this time it was really my carelessness. Chao Yang said, with that demon following us, it's not easy for us to handle things. Now we can only wait for the other 3 people to arrive, and then we can think of other ways to complete the task. Lin Shi said, can you tell us what the mission goal is now? Chao Yang said, I can tell you first that there is actually a very ancient magic family lurking around here, the Stephen family. This time, we are going to this family to get something for Mr. Guo. Do we understand now? Lin Shi said, there may be many treasures in a family like this, right? Which one should we take? Or should we take all of them? Chow Yun frowned while holding his arm and said, no comment. Lin Shi turned to Shi Rushwang and said, it seems we need to explore the Stephen family. Only by knowing ourselves and the enemy can we be invincible in 100 battles. Shi Rushwang smiled sweetly and said, okay. Lin Shi wiped the goosebumps on his arm and said, what's going on with you lately? At this moment, Chow Yun coldly said, absolutely not. You have no idea how strong this magic family is and how deep its heritage is. You just rushed over so recklessly. Yu reading www.yuukangshu.net will only disturb the old monsters of this family. No, you have already scared the snake with grass. I don't know if Gua always knows if he will crush me. It's really despicable. Lin Shi said, since Mr. Gua has been preparing for a long time, I believe there should be detailed information about the Stephen family, right? At least there should be information about old monsters at various levels. Knowing these should be enough. Do you think going to the Stephen family is a monster hunt? Chow Yun wiped his sweat and said, the answer is definitely not, but the person who is about to come is more familiar with the Stephen family, and that's all I know. Lin Shi thought for a moment and said, since that's the case, I'll go explore the way. After that, he shook his body and took out a pair of glasses to put on. I'll become a good student in the college. Shi Rushwang shook her body and lifted her long hair, saying, I will become a genius female student in the college. The two of them hugged their arms and leaned against their backs, while turning their heads to look at Chow Yun and saying, it's definitely not a good idea for us to explore the Stephen family. However, Chow Yun was seen standing still with his mouth slightly open. Lin Shi said, don't you like it? We can also become. Chow Yun extended his palm and said, stop. You can't go anywhere until the other three arrive. Otherwise, the responsibility for the mission failure will lie entirely with the two of you. Lin Shi changed back to his original state and said, now that the faces of the three of us have been seen by each other, we will still have to change our faces. Chow Yun waved his hands and said, you two treasures, my heart is in turmoil now. Please let me be quiet. Then he rubbed his face with both hands and walked to the side. Shi Rushwang couldn't help but say, Lin Shi, what should we do now? Lin Shi said, since that's the case, we can only wait for the other three people to come and talk about it. Chapter 3. Other teammates. You are listening at novelfull.audio. At the same time, in an unknown secret room, the sound of tower suddenly rang out. Under the dim light, there were stones stained with blood colliding against the wall. Under the light and shadow, every stone collides with the wall, and a figure falls to the ground along with it. I saw a burly man with a fashionable beard curling his mouth and popping out stones one by one, piercing through a row of living people kneeling by the wall in order. There was a young woman standing beside the burly man, watching coldly as the living people were each knocked down by stones. The burly man suddenly threw the stone in his hand, clattered, into a golden plate and said, oh no, it's not playing anymore. What's going on? That little monkey was not killed directly by the stone I popped out just now. Is his body made of magic condensate? The young woman said, young Master Carl saw the inadequacy of these three people from the beginning. Bethel, we need to be prepared this time, and these three people will definitely make a comeback. Humph, the burly man named Biceps pursed his lips and sneered, pinching his fingers. Next time I see him, I'll pinch that little monkey into a ball from the middle of his spine. At that time, his bones will definitely sound like popcorn. Humph. More than an hour later, an old man appeared outside the forest where Lin Shi and the others were staying. Chow Yun said, this is Joseph, the sixth butler of the Stephen family. He will be responsible for guiding us on our next actions in the city of Skye. Joseph's eyebrows were thick, with a drooping expression. However, beneath his thick eyebrows, there was a gleam of brilliance, and he said, are these two soy sauce members involved in the operation? Chow Yun said, cough cough, yes, General Manager Gua called on them to cooperate with us. Joseph said, this young man is a source, isn't he? Lin Shi reached out and caressed the muscles above, saying, you're not mistaken, I'm a beginner. Is the beginner great source really impressive? Joseph's old eyes flickered under his eyebrows and he said, as far as I know, the source does not have combat power at all and can only do some auxiliary work. However, the auxiliary work is definitely not as good as our magicians. In addition, the source power fluctuations of the source are not very easy to recognize, especially when most people are magicians. You will only be considered a living target when you appear there. Shi Rushuang quickly said, he is very strong, has a lot of strength, and can fight very well. How strong can it be? Joseph said indifferently, how about this? Since you are the source, you can build a base here and perhaps help us fight for reinforcements. Lin Shi said, let me build a base. Do you plan to pacify the city of Sky? At this moment, Chow Yang said, Lin Shi, Joseph is our guide. Since he thinks you are not suitable to go, there must be some reason. You and Shi Rushuang should stay here and wait for orders. At this moment, Joseph said, it's this little girl who has a strong spiritual power. Although her cultivation is a bit low, following us may come in handy. Shi Rushuang couldn't help but open her eyes wide and say, can I really? Lin Shi couldn't help but say, hey, I can conceal the energy breath, and even become able to emit a magical breath. Isn't that okay? Joseph said indifferently, your proud hidden breath skill is like paper paste in front of the masters of the Stephen family. The base you create is not entirely useless, and in critical moments, it can provide us with a large number of magical sacrifices. Lin Shi couldn't help but sweat and said, I created some creatures to be used as magical sacrifices for you. Joseph nodded slowly and said, not bad. This way, your beginner-level cultivation of the Great Source can be fully utilized. Only foolish source practitioners will run to the enemy and compete with others. Lin Shi said, isn't that unfortunate? Actually, I'm not good at creating things, However, a suspended energy window suddenly appeared in front of Joseph. He looked at the data on it and said, Lin Shi, a legendary card maker, has countless top-quality cards. Often, as soon as a card flows out, he will be immediately snatched by the card player. He turned the energy screen and pointed to the photo above, saying, this person is you, right? Lin Shi. Shi Rushuang chuckled and said, that's right, he's just a card seller, Lin Shi wiped his sweat and said, making cards and making creatures are two different things, okay? And as far as I know, magic sacrifices use living beings with souls, while the creatures I make have no souls and can only be manually controlled. Joseph turned to look at Chow Yang and said, Mr. Gua said, what can he help us with? Chow Yang said, I didn't say anything, I just said he must participate. Joseph couldn't help but ponder. Shi Rushuang pulled Lin Shi and whispered, the creature you created has no soul. Lin Shibi made a shush gesture and said, isn't it deadly to make offerings with souls for them? Shi Rushuang covered her mouth and smiled, I should have guessed earlier, hee. Lin Shi couldn't help but say in his mind, Xiao Kuang, do you feel that Shi Rushuang's character has suddenly changed? Xiao Kuang said, it's okay, it's quite cute. Lin Shi said, what I'm saying is that her personality is not the same as before. Xiao Kuang said, almost, you must have made a mistake. Lin Shi couldn't help but wipe off his sweat. After a while, a young woman walked into the forest again. She had long brown hair and her brown eyes gave off a much brighter feeling. Chow Yang introduced, this is the top assassin of our Red Wave, Luo Qi. Red Wave is a major pirate near Lin Shi's native plane. Gua Wanlong, Chow Yang, Luo Qi, and the defeated Slayer are all members of Red Wave. The entire temple area near Lin Shi's native plane has been occupied by Red Wave. In addition, Red Wave also operates the Space Basketball Professional League. Luo Qi has a cultivation level of beginner martial arts, and Lin Shi shook hands with her and said, there are not many martial artists with such a high level of existence. Luo Qi said indifferently, there are many. Chao Yang smiled and said, what she means is that there are actually many great weapons in the multiverse, but you haven't encountered them yet. Lin Shi smiled and said, I am ignorant and ignorant. Luo Qi turned to Chao Yang and said, he is very strong. Who? Chao Yang couldn't help but say, Lin Shi. He is indeed very strong in running. Oh, by the way, we met 3 wizard assassins before, and one of them bounced a stone to attack Lin Shi. With the source's recovery ability, should we now fill it up? Lin Shi patted her chest and said, all right, thank you for your concern. The eyes under Joseph's thick eyebrows, which had been silent all along, flashed brightly and he said, did a magician hit you with a stone? Chao Yang said, yes, we encountered 3 wizard assassins in the Beer Desert, and one of them, a tall man, lost a stone. These 3 people are very likely members of the Stephen family and I forgot to tell you. Joseph couldn't help but look up at Lin Shi again and then said in a deep voice, I remember the mission requirement was not to disturb any members of the Stephen family, right? Chao Yang spread out his hand and said, it's our Dayuan teammates' fault. Yu reading www.yuukangshu.net actually killed a moth to pretend to be handsome. Joseph said, no wonder the atmosphere in the Stephen family was a bit strange when I came out. However, this may also be related to the arrival of the Brew family, but no matter what, we have already started to panic now. Chao Yang glanced at Lin Shi and smiled, that's what I mean, Joseph said, Stephen's castle is already as solid as gold. I used to owe Mr. Gua a favor before agreeing to help, but now it's difficult. Even though 2 old masters recently left Stephen's castle and the Brew family happened to visit, Stephen's castle has definitely strengthened its defense now. This is not for fun. If the situation is not good, the 2 old masters who left will quickly return to Sky City. Lin Shi said, what do you mean? Luo Qi compared his sword and said, kill. Chao Yang said, that's not enough. We'll have to wait until the mission fails before we kill. But Lin Shi, you have to do your best to assist us this time. You can't say a word of no, what do you think? Shi Rushwang couldn't help but frown and say, do you think we want to team up with you? Only Lin Shi and I can complete the task. Chao Yang's head emitted a puddle of steam and said, I've been wondering why Mr. Gua came to see you, hee. At this moment, Joseph said, no, since the people of the Stephen family have noticed you now, I don't think we can act separately. Lin Shi, Shi Rushwang, if you no longer make mistakes, I am willing to continue to be your teammates. Chao Yang couldn't help but frown and said, okay. We should really unite now. When the last person comes over, let's study what to do next. Chapter 4. Magic Encyclopedia. You are listening at novelfull.audio. So the 4 of them continued to wait. After a while, Luo Qi found Shi Rushwang and Chao Yang beside him said, let her see your assassination ability. Shi Rushwang chuckled and said, don't think that you are a beginner martial arts expert and I'm afraid of you. Let me tell you, the great beings I have killed don't have 1,000, there are also 800. Luo Qi raised his right arm and waved, saying, come on. Chao Yang added, use your most powerful move. Shi Rushwang couldn't help but take out the Annihilation Star and say, this is what you said. Don't cry if I kill you later. Annihilation Star is a dagger made by Lin Shi using 9th grade Dao Jin, Annihilation Star Amber, Purple Night Flower, and various materials. Later, after being illuminated by node beads, Annihilation Star is of extremely high quality with a 2nd grade lower level. In addition, due to the inlay of Miaxing Amber, Miaxing can greatly increase the user's mental strength, which is suitable for assassins like Shi Rushwang who have the power of imagination. The green beetle sealed in Miaxing Amber also has even more terrifying power at this moment, Luo Qi looked at the star-destroying dagger in Shi Ruoxuang's hand and said, "This is not an ordinary dagger." "Hey he," Shi Ruoxuang said with one hand crossed over her waist and a smile, "I thought you could only say 2 words in one sentence. Do you know how powerful you are now?" Luo Qi waved and said, "Come on. You." Shi Ruoxuang couldn't help but tightly grasp the extinguished star, and her expression suddenly became serious. Chao Yang quickly withdrew and said, "Assassins are the most dangerous to confront." With a ping-pong sound, a pink light suddenly flashed through the forest, and Shi Ruoxuang appeared 5 or 6 meters behind Luo Qi, holding the star of extinction. Chao Yang couldn't help gritting his teeth and said, "Is it over?" "Lin," she said, "it's probably just the beginning." Before she could finish speaking, Shi Ruoxuang suddenly bulged her cheeks and spun towards Luo Qi behind her, thrusting towards him. With a ping-pong sound, the 2 graceful shadows intertwined and separated again. However, this time Shi Ruoxuang did not stop, but turned into pink lights that continued to attack Luo Qi. The sound of ping-pong in the forest suddenly became one. However, no matter how Shi Ruoxuang attacked, Luo Qi remained motionless and even closed his eyes indifferently. Chao Yang couldn't help but say, "She is truly the super assassin of our league. I can't even see how she acted." At this moment, Shi Ruoxuang suddenly slid out a long distance, stepping on the big tree behind her with 1 foot, and she brought up large leaves on the ground. "Eh! You forced me to do this." Shi Ruoxuang gritted her teeth and said, holding on to Mia Xing with her back hand. Suddenly, a dazzling red light appeared on the dagger. Chao Yang couldn't help but say, "Did she unleash the special power of this dagger?" "Lin," she said, "Yes." Across from Shi Ruoxuang, Luo Qi opened his eyes and took out a small and exquisite dagger. Lin Shi scanned it with source power and found that the dagger had a 3rd-grade intermediate quality. Although its quality was nearly 1 grade lower than Shi Ruoxuang's star annihilation, weapons above the 3rd grade usually had extremely strong power and should not be underestimated. After Shi Ruoxuang activated the power of the star-destroying amber, a 2 to 3 meter long pink air blade extended from above this dagger. This air blade was completely generated by Shi Ruoxuang's psychic power, making a hissing sound like a flame burning. At this moment, Luo Qi's body moved and flew lightly towards Shi Ruoxuang. "Humph!" Shi Ruoxuang snorted coldly and rushed towards Luo Qi with a flash of his body shape. With a ping-pong sound, the forest was suddenly lit up by a cold light. Immediately after, Shi Ruoxuang rolled over from the ground to the side. As soon as she squatted on the ground and stopped, Luo Qi appeared in front of her with a strange and light float. Shi Ruoxuang finally showed a surprised expression and quickly defended herself horizontally, only hearing a few dang-dang sounds. With the small dagger in his hand, Luo Qi kept pushing her back, and their figures quickly disappeared into the forest. Chao Yang hugged his arm and chuckled, "Ah, see. This is the difference between professional and amateur. Hurry up and ask your buddies to find a place to hide." "Lin," she said, "I think my friend is pretty good. She can withstand so many moves under Luo Qi's command, which shows that she is capable of handling this task." Chao Yang couldn't help but snort coldly upon hearing this. At this moment, Lin Shi's expression suddenly changed and he turned his head to look in the other direction. He saw a burly figure appearing there at some point, holding his arm and watching the confrontation between Shi Ruoxuang and Luo Qi. Chao Yang noticed Lin Shi's gaze, turned his head, and couldn't help but laugh, "Aha, the last teammate has arrived." The burly man flew over and stood still, clasping his fists and saying, "You're the contact person Chao Yang, right?" Chao Yang said, "Not bad. Since we're all here now, I'll go tell them to stop. It's about time." The burly man waved his hand and said, "This is a rare opportunity. I also want to get to know my teammate's abilities. He should be our teammate, right?" He looked up at Lin Shi and looked up and down with his tiger eyes. Lin Shi clenched his fists and said, "I'm not sure how to address you, Lin Shi. The burly man clenched his fists and said, I'm staying at Lan Gan, the barrier master, but I'm also very confident in battles. Come and give it a try. Chao Yang quickly said, wait, Su Lan Gan, this Lin Shi is a source and not good at combat. How can he compare with you? Hey, then you've taken a wrong look. The burly man looked at Lin Shi and turned his head to Chao Yang. This Lin Daoyou's gaze is not kind at first glance, and he won't disappoint me, ha ha ha. Lin Shi couldn't help but take out a mirror and look at it. Su Lan Gan laughed and said, take the move. Lin Shi quickly looked up and saw Su Lan Gan throwing a purple flame towards him. With a loud bang, the purple flame exploded on him, and the fallen leaves within a radius of 10 meters were instantly burned to ashes by the high temperature. Chao Yang patted his thigh and said, I forgot to mention that this guy's reaction is slow. Don't kill him. I saw purple flames spreading, revealing a burnt black tree. Su Lan Gan couldn't help but look left and right and said, how fast? Is this guy a thief specifically responsible for stealing? Chao Yang also kept turning around to look around and slowly said, it should be, oh, it's really strange. Where is it? Su Lan Gan suddenly raised his hand and snapped his fingers. With a woof sound, a purple light shield appeared around him, quickly covering a range of 100 meters nearby. Ah! There! Chao Yang suddenly reached out and pointed. Su Lan Gan quickly turned her head and saw Lin Shi standing within 100 meters of the purple light shield, rubbing a ball of fire with both hands. Su Lan Gan was not surprised, but rather pleased. He chuckled and said, the power of the source's magic is discounted, right? He reached out and pointed his finger, hitting a series of purple fireballs from his fingertips. These purple fireballs were originally arranged in a straight line, but had not yet hit Lin Shi. Suddenly, they scattered in all directions and surrounded from different directions. Upon seeing this, Lin Shi threw the fireball with both hands and then moved his body, but disappeared in place. Chao Yang quickly said, forget it, this guy can teleport. However, Su Lan Gan ignored what he said, because Lin Shi's fireball spell suddenly burst out from a spatial ripple, less than a meter away from Su Lan Gan. Su Lan Gan quickly snapped her fingers, and a layer of green-on protective cover appeared around her body. With a loud bang, a fireball exploded on the green-on protective cover, causing it to shatter instantly. However, Su Lan Gan was not surprised, as she had already moved and appeared in another position more than 10 meters away. Boom! The remaining fireball exploded near Chao Yang, lifting a pile of fallen leaves. At this moment, Su Lan Gan chuckled and said, everyone knows the basic skill of teleportation, but Lin Daoyou's fireball technique is so powerful that not all fellow-level sources can achieve it. Lin Shi appeared nearby and said, I'm flattered. The way my fellow disciple controls the fireball is also impressive. Do you plan to compete with me in hand-to-hand combat next? Oh, Su Lan Gan took out a pair of glasses and put them on, shaking her head, saying, I'm most afraid of close combat and hand-to-hand combat. Although I'm a strong man, I'm actually very gentle. At this moment, Luo Qi and the crying Shi Rushwang also walked over. Lin Shi looked at Shi Rushwang's injuries and found that he had not been severely injured. Perhaps he was not convinced and that's why he cried, right? Chao Yang called Joseph over and said, all right, I believe we have a basic understanding between us. It's not too late. Let's study how to obtain the secret treasure of the Stephen family. Su Lan Gan said, what kind of treasure is it? It's surprising that such a powerful team has been assembled. Chao Yang raised his hand and released a semi-transparent magic cube, saying, what about this thing? It's called the Magic Encyclopedia. Ordinary wizards don't need this thing at all, but it's very useful for our guardians. So, our goal is to steal this magic encyclopedia from Stephen Castle. As long as we can safely hand it over to guardians, our mission is considered complete. Lin Shi, who was comforting Shi Rushwang, was momentarily stunned when he heard the words, Magic Encyclopedia, and turned his head to look at the magic cube. Sulan Gon said, Magic Encyclopedia, does this seem like something only found in legends? Is it really there? At this moment, Joseph said, magic scriptures have always been stored in extremely safe places. The Stephen family, as a magic scripture, has also guarded countless treasures for thousands of years. It does exist, but the difficulty of obtaining it is also very high, far greater than obtaining other treasures of the Stephen family. Sulan Gon pinched her glasses and carefully looked at the magic scripture, saying, the existence of guarding this thing is probably very tricky, isn't it? Joseph said, usually, the three masters of the Stephen family take turns guarding the magic encyclopedia. However, recently two masters have been out on business, and with the visit of the Brew family, the remaining masters may not stay in the secret room where the magic encyclopedia is stored, so we have a chance to seize it on the front line. Sulan Gon released an energy screen and said, what level is Mr. Stevens? How many people are there near the Chamber of Secrets? What kind of barrier is there? Chao Yang said, the three major monsters of the Stephen family are all mid-level masters, and there are still many entry-level masters to defend in the Stephen castle. Joseph said, in terms of barriers, there are 100 defensive barriers near the Chamber of Secrets, each with different powers. Only those holding the keys of the family elders can enter safely. Chapter 5. Who is a maid? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Sulan Gon couldn't help but say, 100 layers of barriers. It takes me 100 minutes to break through every one in 1 minute. Chao Yang shook his head and said, it seems that we can only start with the key of the family elder. So, I understand why General Gua called you the source. Her purpose is for you to create a key. He looked at Lin Shi. Lin Shi said, I'm afraid the three chieftains wouldn't carry this valuable key with them. Even if they carry it with them, whether I release source power or spiritual power, they will detect it. Chao Yang chuckled and said, at this point, it depends on your little friend. As long as she uses the beauty trick, you have a chance to get the key. Lin Shi couldn't help but say, I'm sorry, she doesn't know how to trick people. Chao Yang said, did you forget what I said before? You two have no room for negotiation, and she doesn't know how to do it. Lin Shi said, if you insist on doing so, let's split up. How about that? At this moment, Joseph said, the Douglas master who stayed at Stephen's castle, I don't know where he hid the family elder key, so it's not the time to use the beauty trick urgently. Our primary goal now is to find out where the key is as soon as possible. Upon hearing this, Chao Yang pouted and said, Joseph, you were supposed to be responsible for this matter. Now that the Brew family is approaching, there is only one chance. Why don't you hurry up and figure it out? Joseph said, of course it's not enough for me alone. Otherwise, I would have figured out where the key is and I still need someone to assist me. He reached out and pointed to Shi Rushuang, this lady is good. If she were to dress up as a servant and follow me into Stephen's castle, it would be much easier. Lin Shi said, wait, I can disguise myself as a woman and mix in with you. Chao Yang couldn't help but smack his lips and said, why can't this be okay? That's also not okay. When you started bringing people here, didn't you say you had to join this little friend? What's going on? Lin Shi said, Shi Rushuang is only responsible for combat. Joseph said, it seems that Lin Daoyu is very confident in his disguise. Lin Shi said, yes. Then she changed into a girl with fried dough twists braids and said in a clear voice, see. Everyone glanced at him and couldn't help but be momentarily stunned. Joseph coughed twice and said, you've become so beautiful that you're easily targeted by the young masters. Lin Shi thought for a moment and added some wrinkles to her face. Joseph said, this is too old again. At this moment, Shi Rushuang said, if I go, I will go. But I agreed beforehand that if a young master from the Stephen family has ulterior motives against me, don't blame me for using my hands to destroy flowers. Humph. Xiao Yang clapped his palm and pointed at her with a smile. All right, that's it. Now hurry up and go to Stephen's castle. At this moment, Joseph said, if Lin Daoyou's disfigurement is not easily detected, it is indeed most appropriate for him to go. Perhaps he can directly obtain the key. Lin Shi chuckled and said, let's walk. Following Joseph's suggestion, Lin Shi transformed into an ordinary-looking woman and named her Linda. Lin Shi followed Joseph to the magical city of Ski, where the Stephen family was located. From a distance, this magical city was invisible, with buildings of all sizes suspended in the sky, blocking out most of the sunlight projected onto the ground. Therefore, even during the day, the deep buildings on the ground were still brightly lit, giving the impression of both day and night coexisting in this city. Countless magicians and ships of all sizes flew in and out of this city, while Joseph still lowered his head and lowered his eyebrows, driving a flying carpet embroidered with the Stephen family pattern. Linda, an ordinary girl transformed by Lin Shi, stood behind him with her hands tied. Lin Shi looked at the Stephen family pattern on the blanket, and it was clearly a moth. He couldn't help but say, does the Stephen family really like moths? Joseph said, Linda, as the new servant of the Stephen family, it's best not to mention even half a moth. In no time, more and more magicians and ships came and went nearby, and the nearby light was suddenly blocked by the floating buildings in the sky. However, as soon as passing magicians and ships saw the Stephen family moth logo on the flying carpet, they all showed respectful expressions and movements. At this moment, Joseph said, the city of Sky was built by the Stephen family, and in the entire temple area nearby, the Stephen family is also a leading and large family. Lin Shi asked, is the Stephen family the lords of the palace district? Joseph said, maids don't ask such questions. No, maids don't ask questions. Lin Shi couldn't help but wipe off his sweat. Joseph continued, you have only one answer to the orders of the master, young master, housekeeper, and maidservant, which is yes. Lin Shi said, yes. Joseph, who was standing in front, tilted his head slightly and said, this voice is lazy and needs to be scolded. Lin Shi couldn't help but laugh and said, as for what? Joseph turned his head and continued to look ahead, saying, as for you reading www.yuukangshu.net, we must be there, otherwise our actions will only fail. After a while, the flying carpet arrived near a horizontal water pipe several hundred meters high. Joseph suddenly said, Lin Shi, do you have any other ideas besides accepting the mission from Guadalcanal? Lin Shi said, what ideas can you have? Empty the treasures in the castle. Joseph maintained his posture of looking forward with both hands on his back, and said, if that's the case, the Stephen family may be chasing your egg empire. Lin Shi couldn't help but say, just say what you have. Joseph said slowly, haven't you ever thought about why Guadalcanal was interested in the magic encyclopedia? Lin Shi said, what do you mean? Joseph smiled and said, I'm just casually asking. Don't take it seriously, Taoist friend. Regarding the magic encyclopedia, Lin Shi certainly has ideas, because his wife Zhou Tianxin has already practiced 3% of the content of the magic encyclopedia. This time, being able to obtain the magic encyclopedia from the Stephen family will naturally take her magic to the next level. However, it was unexpected that the sixth butler of the Stephen family was also interested in the magic encyclopedia. Although it is unclear what he was thinking, Lin Shi does not intend to tell him his intentions now. At this moment, Xiao Kuang said, if it had been before, you might have said it directly. Lin Shi said, we are only in a cooperative relationship with this Joseph. I think it's better not to tell him everything, and as long as the task is completed and I receive the magic encyclopedia, I can still scan the data. There's no need to go too far. Xiao Kuang said, Master, I think the incident between Xuanzang and Yu Zhulong has had a significant impact on you. After a moment of silence, Lin Shi said, probably. Chapter 6. Entering the Castle. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Decades later, the nearby lights suddenly dimmed, and the flying carpet driven by Joseph gradually slowed down. Lin Shi looked up and saw a land appearing in the sky several thousand meters above, with significantly enhanced magic around it. It seemed that this was the legendary Stephen Castle. Joseph said, "From now on, you only answer when others ask you something, otherwise don't speak." Lin Shi said, "Okay." The flying carpet immediately climbed upwards and gradually saw the white high wall on the edge of the land in the air. Unlike the city of Sky below, this Stephen Castle was very quiet, with no magicians entering or leaving, and not even a bird. The flying carpet driven by Joseph turned and walked parallel to the white high wall. Lin Shi looked up and saw towering blue and black castles towering into the clouds behind the white city walls, which were several hundred meters high, giving a feeling of falling down at any moment. Lin Shi couldn't help but feel a little puzzled in his heart. In terms of the grandeur of the architecture, this Stephen Castle is no less than the Scorpio sect. The Scorpion sect is a sect of cultivators that Lin Shi had visited before. The elder Zai Tian Di Zai Lao Guai, also known as the Old Poison Scorpion, is a mid-level immortal who can use a terrifying poison called Badu. If Lin Shi only uses melee abilities, he may not be a match for this old monster. In no time, Joseph drove the flying carpet to a 1,000-meter-high city gate. Next to the gate was a 10-meter-high small gate, and a group of women dressed as maids were entering in a row. It seems that even if she officially infiltrates Stephen Castle now, Lin Shi's heart is a little nervous. At this moment, the young man leading the group of maids said, "Ah, old Joseph, it's great to see you, oh. Who is this?" Voluka. Joseph lowered his head and lowered his eyebrows. "This is Linda, the maid brought by the old man." Voluka glanced at Lin Shi and laughed heartily. "That's just right. I'm about to take these novice maids to training, so I'll try my best to bring her along." Joseph said, "Oh, no need." Linda had already undergone professional maid training before coming here, and I happen to be short of her as a maid on my end. "Oh, is that so?" Voluka nodded and laughed. "Then I won't say much. I still have to lead these beginners on a mission. Goodbye." Joseph bent slightly. Voluka took a few steps and turned back, saying, "Oh, by the way, Joseph, I heard someone has been plotting against our family recently. You must be careful, old man." He gave Lin Shi a smirk. Joseph nodded slowly and said, "Okay." After Voluka left with a group of novice maids, Joseph continued to use the flying carpet and said on the way, "Voluka is the captain of the Stephen family's guards. With all his strength, he can enter the top 10 of the Stephen family. You must be careful." Lin Shi said, "As the captain of the guard, why would he take the maid into the castle?" Joseph said, "Because the guard area also requires maids to bring tea and pour water." On the way, Joseph continued to introduce the various areas of Stephen's castle. Apart from the larger ones, there were at least a few hundred other small and medium-sized areas, each of which was at least 100 kilometers wide. Lin Shi couldn't help but ask, how many maids are needed for such a large Stephen castle? "Not much," Joseph said indifferently. "I only have around 100,000 maids in the area that I am in charge of." Lin Shi couldn't help but feel that it was almost impossible for Shi Rushuang to encounter danger here. After all, so many maids may not be easily recognized. At this moment, Joseph's flying carpet slowly landed and a middle-aged maid wearing glasses walked out of a nearby cylindrical castle that was 400 to 500 meters wide. Joseph said, "All right, Ms. Parker will teach you the precautions for Stephen's castle next. In addition, she is also the chief maid of this magical queen district." Lin Shi reached out and smiled, "Hello, my name is Linda." With a pop sound, Parker suddenly threw a black ruler out of his hand and hit Lin Shi's palm. She said solemnly, "Bold. How dare the maid take the initiative to shake hands with others?" Lin Shi grabbed the back of his head and said, "I'm sorry." With a pop sound, Parker's ruler hit Lin Shi's palm again, and she said solemnly, "Your hand needs to lift clean plates and utensils. How can you casually grab your hair?" Lin Shi said, "Okay." Not good, if you say so. Parker said sternly. Lynn, she said, yes. Joseph nodded next to him and said, Parker, Linda will leave it to you. Parker clenched his hand and held the ruler, saying, you walk slowly. Joseph immediately drove the flying carpet away with both hands on his back. Parker said, Linda, Linda. Lynn, she said, what can I do for you? No, yes. Parker pushed his glasses and said, follow me to change into a maid outfit. I want to train you to be a qualified maid within a day. Lynn, she said, yes. After changing into the maid outfit, Lynn, she's first feeling was that the outfit made her neck and arms uncomfortable, and the feeling she wore it was completely different from what she saw in the anime. Parker said, I don't care if you're a little elf or a little demon fairy at home. Here, you only have one identity, which is a maid. You can only say yes in any situation. When you meet anyone with status, you must stop and salute them. If you call them wrong, they won't be given food. Lynn, she said, can I use magic to rub bread and eat it? Parker looked at him and said, just stand for a whole day. Lynn, she couldn't help but wipe off his sweat. Subsequently, Parker introduced the big and small masters, young masters, and various influential figures in the castle for several hours without finishing. Lynn, she recorded the data of these characters in the source crystal database. There are a total of 3 masters in the Stephen family, namely Abraham, Douglas, and Clark. These 3 are also the most powerful beings in the Stephen family's magic, and each person has a cultivation level of intermediate level magic. Among them, Douglas Master lives in the spiritual moth district, and this master usually lives in seclusion. Yu reading www.yuukangshu.net rarely leaves this area, and ordinary maids cannot approach it. Lynn, she looked at the distance and found that Douglas lived in the spiritual moth district, which was 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers away from the Magic Queen district. However, in Stephen's castle, ordinary maids were not allowed to fly, and it was not a joke to walk 2,000 kilometers. Of course, if you activate the stealth skill and run over, it won't be difficult for you to reach 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers. It's just that Linshi doesn't yet understand Stephen Castle's scanning ability and doesn't know if he can see through his stealth skill. Linda. Parker suddenly said. Lynn, she quickly said, yes. Parker said, have you remembered all of what I said? Lynn, she said, remember, Ms. Parker. Parker pushed his glasses and said, I've told you so much, how can you remember it all? Lynn, she was stunned for 2 seconds and said, I probably remember, Ms. Parker. Parker said solemnly, remember, lying at Stephen's castle will result in capital punishment. Lynn, she said, I didn't remember, Ms. Parker. I know you can't remember, Parker said coldly with satisfaction. This is the character map of the Stephen family, and there is also the complete guide to maids. I will come back tomorrow to randomly check these knowledge. If Lord Joseph finds out that you are not qualified, then be careful not to get beaten. After saying this, he tapped the black ruler in his palm. Lynn, she said, yes, Ms. Parker. Then Lin Shi arrived at the maid's dormitory with a bunch of books in his arms. Before entering, Xiao Kuang suddenly shouted, I'm going to tell Sister Zhou. Lin Shi wiped his sweat and said, don't cause any trouble. I'll tell you without looking at you. Chapter 7. 5 Roommates. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As soon as Lin Shi walked into the room, he first glanced at the decoration of the dormitory. At this moment, 5 maids were chatting and laughing in the room. As soon as Lin Shi walked in with the maidservant, the room fell silent. All 5 maidservants stood up and bowed to the maidservant, saying, Maidservant. The maidservant was a fat woman with thick arms. She pursed her lips and turned to Lin Shi, saying, Linda, that's it. Lin Shi said, yes, the maid. The obese woman looked at the room with a slightly disdainful pout, and then left the place. Lin Shi looked at the 5 maids who were still looking over here and smiled, my name is Linda, and we will be roommates from now on. Then he walked towards his bed holding a book. The maid's dormitory is very simple, which is somewhat different from the imagined glamorous scene. Each maid only has a small bed, a thin blanket, and a small cabinet, and there is not even a mirror. At this moment, a maid with freckles on her face said, "My name is Claire." Then the other 4 maids all introduced their names. "Lynn," she said, "do you usually not wear makeup?" "Makeup." The 5 maids looked at each other with wide-open eyes. At this moment, Claire said, "Oh, there is a dressing magic at the entrance of the dormitory. We are dressed neatly and cleanly by this magic every day when we go out, but this magic only applies to one maid once a day." "Lynn," she said, "so it's like this." A maid suddenly said, "Linda, I feel like you don't look like a girl." Upon hearing this, several strands of Lin Shi's hair stood up on top of his head. He quickly waved his hand and smiled, "Don't joke, don't you look like a girl, do you look like a little elf?" Because, the 5 girls in the room pointed at him and said, "Where did you learn this action from?" At this moment, Lin Shi was lying with his hands on his pillow, his feet crossed and placed on the small cabinet. When he heard the girls say this, he shook them left and right. At cough cough, Lin Shi quickly withdrew his foot and said, "I'm practicing soft gymnastics, ha ha ha. Aren't you tired? Hurry up and rest." In fact, another reason why Lin Shi made this move is that she can stand with her feet against the wall and her back against the women, so no matter what kind of scene they appear, they won't see it. This way, the little madman has nothing to say, right? Xiao Kuang said, "As a mind reader, with a sweep of your mental energy, it's clear at a glance that you still need to use your eyes to see." Lin Shi said, "It's not like a mind reader reaching this level where their spiritual power can be swept away at a glance, hee hee." Xiao Kuang couldn't help but shout, "Are you really planning to sneak a peek at these girls changing clothes?" Lin Shi said, "Don't joke." At the same time, Claire said, "The dormitory will automatically turn off the lights later. Of course, we need to chat for a while longer while we still have time. We are so busy in the castle every day, how can we have time to talk?" The other 4 girls all nodded. At this moment, the girls all asked, "Linda, where do you come from?" Lin Shi said, "I came from Georgetown." This was the identity that Joseph had arranged for Lin Shi beforehand. A girl couldn't help but put her hands together and said with longing, "Georgetown, I heard the scenery there is very beautiful." After the girls chattered for a while, Claire suddenly said, "Linda, don't you like to talk?" Lin Shi said, "It's okay, huh?" The girls couldn't help but say, "Like Mary, there are now 2 people in our dormitory who don't like to talk." Mary quickly said, "I'm not someone who can't speak." "You're just too tired to speak," the girls giggled. At this moment, I suddenly heard the rough voice of the maid coming from outside the hallway. "Still laughing? Little rascals, hurry up and rest for me. I still have to work tomorrow." The 5 girls in the dormitory suddenly opened their bright eyes and fell silent like cicadas. In no time, the dormitory lights went out, and Lin Shi lay in bed with his eyes slowly turning. Xiao Kuang suddenly shouted, "Your eyes." Lin Shi wiped his sweat and said, "They just changed it." "So, whose system are you?" After a while, Xiao Kuang suddenly said, "Master, why haven't you slept yet?" Lin Shi turned around, closed his eyes and leaned in for a while, then suddenly opened them again and said in his mind, "Something's wrong." Xiao Kuang chuckled and said, "It's clear that a terrifying monster ran into the girls' dormitory, so I can't sleep, right?" Lin Shi said, "No, I feel a bit uncomfortable all over. I don't know what's going on." Speaking cautiously, he released a hint of spiritual energy. Xiao Kuang suddenly shouted, "Master." Lin Shi carefully scanned the room with his spiritual power and found that everything was normal except for the presence of magic at the door. If someone else's spiritual power scanned him, unless it was a legendary high-level existence, he would probably have noticed it. So where does this strange feeling come from? Thinking of this, Lin Shi couldn't help but turn his eyes to the 5 sleeping maids in the room, who had worked hard all day and were now sleeping soundly. Xiao Kuang shouted loudly, "Lord!" Lin Shi held on to Xiao Kuang's mouth and said in his mind, "This situation is not very good. If Douglas is casting unknown magic on me, it will be a bit troublesome." Before he could finish speaking, a faint mental energy suddenly swept through the room. Lin Shi and Xiao Kuang quickly paused in their minds, and this faint mental energy did indeed fall on Lin Shi. After a brief scan, it swept towards Lin Shi's mind. Actually, scanning the new maid to see if it's dangerous. Lin Shi can understand. Yu reading www.yuukangshu.net, but are these Steven family guys even scanning someone else's memory? This weak spiritual force indeed quietly penetrated into Lin Shi's mind. Lin Shi's mind immediately generated Linda's memory and spiritual power, allowing this spiritual power to scan. At the same time, her own spiritual power carefully avoided this weak spiritual power scan. In no time, this weak spiritual force quietly exited the room. Lin Shi said in his mind, "But if it weren't for the Steven family, it would be a bit strange. Is it possible that there are other high-level and powerful people here?" Xiao Kuang trembled and said, "And they also have the same idea as you. It's so scary." Lin Shi thought for a while and felt lost for the time being, so he took a big nap. Meanwhile, Steven Castle, in an unknown area. The young man in long robes, who sent 3 assassins to attack Lin Shi and others, was standing in front of the circular table with crystal balls and said, "It's strange that none of the new people entering the castle today are from the other side." The white-haired old man with hands turned upside down said, "Young master, perhaps the other party has already been scared away by our assassin." The young man in the robe shook his head decisively and said, "It's impossible. You can go see Joseph. He has been out of the castle today and see if he can reveal anything." The old man with a negative hand said, "Yes, Master Carl, please rest early too." The young man in the robe said, "I am waiting for your message here." The old man with a negative hand said, "Yes, young master." After bowing, he turned around and walked out of the room. Chapter 8. Black Bat. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The young man in the robe turned his head to look at the basketball-sized crystal balls in the room, but suddenly stopped moving. Immediately after, there was a rustling sound coming from the pitch-black passage, which was incredibly fast. In the blink of an eye, more than 10 black bats flew out of it. The young man in the robe turned his back to the passage and remained motionless. Suddenly, a flame burst out from around his body. With just a few creaks, these black bats touched the flame and immediately screamed and turned into ashes. "Humph, Carl." A burst of arrogant cold laughter came from the channel. The young man in a robe named Carl Steven didn't look back and said calmly, "John." In the passage, a black mist suddenly swelled up, and then it parted left and right under the swaying lights. A man wearing a black leather jacket and tight pants walked out of it. The man had a black bat icon on his face and sneered, "Carl, my brother. There are people in the castle responsible for defense. Why do you have to stay here all night? Do you think the girls in Sky City are not spicy enough? Or do you think the wine is not refreshing enough?" Carl Steven clung to the table with both hands and said, "If you don't care about your family, you can go and play to your heart's content." "What if I don't play?" John Steven chuckled, "These jumping mice are different and will all be killed in the end." He walked up to the circular table and slid his finger along as he walked. Carl Steven's eyes turned and he followed John Steven's moving figure, saying, "What do you mean?" John Steven glanced at him and sneered, "Don't you understand? I asked you to come play with me." Carl Steven said, "Excuse me for not accompanying you." John Steven said, "You probably thought I was an invitation, right? Let me show you something fun." As he reached out, a black light shot from his fingertips towards a crystal ball in front of Carl Steven. In the midst of this crystal ball, there was a scene that revealed a brown-haired woman with a cold expression. Carl Stephen frowned and said, so what about spicy girls? Fool, John Stephen continued walking around the circular wooden table, sneering, this guy is one of the mice you've been longing for so long. Upon hearing this, Carl Stephen's eyes flickered as he looked at the crystal ball and said, Magic Mud Town, is this possible? This place is far from the beer desert. At this moment, John Stephen had walked across from Carl Stephen and chuckled, only fools would return to the place where they were found. These shrewd mice would never have run to Ski City that day. So, they would definitely choose to appear in a place far away from both of these places. Draw a compass on the map, and you can find them. Carl Stephen was not surprised, but instead calmly looked up at him and slowly said, You're not helping me in vain, are you? John Stephen snapped his fingers and said, Don't say it so harshly. We are at least brothers, but since you asked, I don't mind telling you. You must have heard of the Brew family's dispatch, right? Carl Stephen's eyes slowly turned with him and he said, Let me guess. You probably don't care about whether the two families cooperate, nor do you worry about whether these people will come over and have any ulterior motives towards the family. So, perhaps one of the few people who came over is a beautiful woman. John Stephen opened his arms and smiled, You are not the only one who has contributed to the family, as he approached Carl Stephen and stood still. He took out a photo and said, Be my partner, take care of her. Carl Stephen moved his eyes and saw a blonde beauty in the photo. He couldn't help but say, I knew it. Ha ha ha. John Stephen's arrogant laughter echoed far away from the pitch-black passage. At the same time, an elderly man with white hair and negative hands appeared on the top floor of a tower, where there was also an old man with thick eyebrows hanging down from his head. The old man with negative hands said, Joseph. Joseph turned to look at the old man with a negative hand and said, Alan. The old man with a negative hand named Alan walked slowly to the window and said, The moonlight is so beautiful, but I don't know how many more days we can see it. Joseph said, An envoy from the Magic family has just come over. Alan looked at him with both hands on his back and said, It doesn't seem that simple, does it? Joseph lowered his head and frowned, What do you mean? Alan said, I don't believe you went to Georgetown just to bring back a maid. Joseph said, I have a Miss Anna who has changed to several close maids, and I have no choice but to personally find them. Alan stared at him for a moment and said, Are you joking with me? Joseph said, Absolutely not. Alan said, As you know, Mr. Carl, who I am in charge of, is currently in a rage. If I don't ask him what he wants, it will be difficult to get back to him. After a moment of silence, Joseph suddenly raised his thick eyebrows, revealing a pair of shining old eyes, and slowly said, You don't have to worry. Alan walked up the stairs and said, I hope so. Joseph continued to stand in place like a sculpture, with the moonlight shining through the window on half of his body, still looking down and frowning. Meanwhile, Moni Town. Shi Rushuang sat in front of a table with one hand pounding her cheeks, while Chao Yang's voice rang in her ear. The chance of us appearing in this place is very low. The other party now mostly thinks that we think the darkness under the lamp will run to the city of Sky or the beer desert. They are completely wrong. We are now going to Sky as a magician in Magic Mud Town, and there will be no suspicion. Shi Rushuang pursed his lips and took out a skewer of roasted scorpions to nibble on. However, since the last time he went to the scorpion sect to buy a lot and asked Lin Shi to make a lot, these roasted scorpions have also eaten almost enough now. At the same time, Su Longon in the communicator said, I think it's quite risky for us to appear in Magic Mud Town at the same time. Even if we pretend we don't know anyone now, there are still several people, and the target is still too big. Since the Stephen family has moth demons in places like the beer desert, I believe this kind of demon will also exist here. Chao Yang said, There's no need to worry about this. I've scanned dozens of towns around me and there's no such moth infestation, so that's why I chose this area. Shi Rushuang clattered on a greasy pair of pliers, her gaze fixed on a black bat hanging upside down from the eaves outside the window. She couldn't help but say, the bats in this place are really strange, they are actually black. After a moment of silence, Chow Yang suddenly shouted, "Not good. This black bat is also a demon." Before the words could be finished, a rustling sound suddenly came from outside the window. Countless black bats appeared in the sky like magic and flew to the vicinity of the window in an instant. With just a few clicks, the window was suddenly shattered by these black bats, followed by a clattering sound. More than 10 black bats rolled and fell to Shi Rushwang's feet in the splashing broken glass. She quickly stood up and retreated, but more bats swarmed in, shouting and rushing towards her. Chapter 9. Roommate Mary. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. Shi Rushwang quickly scolded and opened a pink protective cover around her body. Immediately after, she heard a series of crunching sounds that made her teeth ache. These black bats opened their mouths and bit into the pink protective cover, their black teeth biting into it several centimeters deep one by one. Humph. Shi Rushwang frowned and her 10 fair fingers quickly flicked, firing hundreds of pink air blades and cutting these black bats into pieces. Humph, ah. A burst of wild laughter suddenly came out of the dark bat swarm outside the window. Shi Rushwang looked up and said, "So the main leader is here." After speaking, he suddenly disappeared into place. The wild laughter continued, coming and going, as if one could move freely among a pack of bats. However, soon after, a scream of, "Ah!" came and a group of black bats dispersed, revealing a young man in black who had been stabbed in the chest with a dagger. Shi Rushwang, who was suspended behind him, covered her small mouth and exclaimed in surprise, "This figure. A handsome man." Before he could finish speaking, the young man wearing a black leather jacket and tight pants suddenly became pitch black, exploding into countless black sand spreading in all directions. Shi Rushwang placed a dagger horizontally in front of her to resist the black sand. When she stopped in mid-air and looked up, the young man in black had already exploded without a trace. At this moment, Chow Yang shouted in the communicator, "How are you? How are you doing?" Shi Rushwang was about to speak when Luo Qi said, "The fire mage is dead." Shi Rushwang said, "I will also kill a handsome man who puts bats here." Chow Yang said, "That's great. I didn't expect these guys to move so fast, and there might be followed-up assassins chasing after us. We'll each use our abilities to disperse now and gather in Sky City in 5 days." Meanwhile, Stephen Castle, in a dimly lit room. Carl Stephen and John Stephen opened their eyes at the same time, looking at each other and seeing a cold sweat on each other's foreheads. John Stephen wiped the cold sweat off his forehead and said, "Be good, I dare say this is a bunch of big rats." Carl Stephen said seriously, "Now they are all on guard. It won't be so easy to find and kill them again." John Stephen patted his shoulder and said, "Don't worry, with your brother around, these mice have some skills since they dare to come and attack our Stephen family. However, compared to me, John Stephen, they are far behind. Humph, they just got one clone killed. The show is only starting now." Carl Stephen walked towards the passage and slowly said, "I want to tell Father Douglas the truth about this." "Hey, wait a minute." John Stephen stepped forward and grabbed him, saying, "Now my grandfather is gathering his energy in waiting for the envoy of the Brew family. He doesn't have time at all. He's just a few mice, so there's no need to bother him, right?" Carl Stephen turned his head to look at him and said, "What exactly do you want to do?" "To contribute to the family," John Stephen chuckled. "You help me deal with that little girl from the Blue family, and I help you deal with these mice. Our brothers work together seamlessly, ha ha ha." He smiled and suddenly stopped his voice. He looked down at Carl Stephen's eyes and said, "In this way, we are much stronger than the other young masters, humph humph humph." Upon hearing this, Carl Stephen nodded and said, "Okay, but if we still can't clean them up, I still have to tell my ancestors." "No problem, good," John Stephen chuckled. The next morning, Lin Shi suddenly got up from the bed, and saw that the sisters in the dormitory were busy preparing. He quickly took the maid's dress from the small cabinet and put it on. At the same time, he said in his mind, "The black silk stockings have the effect of tightening the fat. Make your legs look slimmer." Xiao Kuang couldn't help but say, "Master, you don't have any other thoughts about your legs, do you?" Lin Shi put down his leg and said, "You've been thinking about it for too long, and this is my leg after I changed my face, so it's not my own leg, hee. Master!" Xiao Kuang suddenly shouted loudly. In no time, the maids were busy leaving the dormitory. Claire turned around and said, "Mary, please tidy up today's room too." The other girls also turned around and said. Lin Shi couldn't help but turn her head to look at Mary in the room, who was currently making the bed. Upon hearing this, she turned her head and smiled, "It's okay, let me handle it." Lin Shi's eyes suddenly froze and he said in his mind, "I found out the reason for the cold in his back last night." Xiao Kuang couldn't help but say, "Is it because of this Mary?" Lin Shi said, "Not bad, because this girl has a protagonist vibe." At the same time, the maids had already lined up and walked out of the aisle. Xiao Kuang wiped his sweat and said, "Master, you are becoming increasingly strange. Even with the protagonist by your side, you can feel a chill on your back." Lin Shi said, "What's so strange about this? Although there are protagonists everywhere in the multiverse, not all of them may be beneficial to us, just like this roommate Mary. If she is not careful, she may expose my identity." Xiao Kuang said, "You see, she helps all her roommates make beds and dormitories, which shows that she is a very good person. Even if you tell her your identity, I bet she won't betray you." Lin Shi said, "That's not the problem." Xiao Kuang couldn't help but say, "So you're looking for a chance to kill her?" Lin Shi wiped his sweat and said, "Obviously not that problem. You probably don't understand novels with girls as the main characters. Usually, the women around her become villains, and all the men around her will like her. Do you understand what I mean? That is to say, I will unconsciously become the villain, and the fate of the villain is very obvious, which is to be discovered and killed." Xiao Kuang suddenly shouted, "Oh, I know. You will both fall in love with her and become a villain. Because you now have both a man's heart and a woman's body, that's why you have both effects at the same time. Shouldn't it be too late?" Lin Shi wiped his sweat and said, "Fool, I do become a maid now, but I definitely won't like this Mary, are you kidding?" Xiao Kuang couldn't help but say, "So you still have to kill her?" Lin Shi said, "How could it be so easy to kill the protagonist? If I slap her to death, I will soon be discovered by Douglas. If I throw a low-power skill, she is likely to fall ahead of time. If I design a secret room to kill, there is a high possibility that a famous detective will emerge. I have also exposed myself by killing 3 or not, so now what I need to do is try to keep a distance from this Mary as much as possible." Xiao Kuang suddenly said, "Master, you can still be her best friend in the novel. The female protagonist's best friend is neither antagonist nor needs to keep a distance from her." Lin Shi couldn't help but wipe off his sweat. At the same time, the obese maidservant was lecturing the maids, and in no time, Lin Shi and Mary were summoned by the maidservant. Lin Shi couldn't help but say in his mind, "What's going on? Why is it that the more you want to keep a distance from this Mary, the more you are pulled together thinking of this?" He turned his head to look at Mary walking beside him. Mary also gave him a gentle smile. Lin Shi's heart twitched and he quickly turned to look ahead. Chapter 10. Mary's Dream. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The maidservant led the two into a tall cylindrical building, and the three of them climbed up the spiral staircase for several decades before finally reaching the door of a room. "Let's go in," the maidservant said and stood aside with her hands tied. Lin Shi and Mary exchanged a glance and walked into the room side by side. The walls around this room were filled with various magic books. Lin Shi glanced over and saw several magic books blinking at him. There are still many feathers floating in the room, which will automatically fly to the vicinity of these magic books for cleaning. And behind the table in the middle of the room, there was a chair with its back facing the door. Lin Shi and Mary stood ready to speak when the chair turned around, revealing a middle-aged woman sitting on it. The middle-aged woman said, "I am Donna Morgan from the Magistrates District. I have summoned you today to go to the Magistrates District and take care of Master Charles." Lin Shi looked at the map in his mind, and it seemed that the Magic Prince District was more than 500 kilometers closer to the Spiritual Moth District than the Magic Queen District, giving him a better chance of getting close to Douglas. However, at this moment, Lin Shi noticed that Mary's face was a bit pale and her breathing became rapid. The middle-aged woman named Donna Morgan nodded at a pen in her hand and said, "The Magician's District is different from your leisurely magical Queen's District. It is inhabited by the most promising young masters and ladies of the Stephen family, and you must have a certain level of magical knowledge to work there. In other words, you will become a senior maid." She reached out and pointed to the magic book in the room, continuing, "But you need to master all the magic books in this room within a week. If you don't meet my requirements, then you will return to the Magic Queen's District. Do you understand?" Lin Shi and Mary both said, "Yes, Ms. Morgan." On the way back to the Demon Queen's District, the maid had already left. Lin Shi asked, "Is that Charles a very scary young master?" Mary shook her head. Lin Shi thought for a moment, but didn't ask much. What if she asked too much and became someone else's best friend? At this moment, Mary's eyes sparkled and she said, "Actually, I wanted to be a magician when I was very young, and I didn't expect to have such a chance today." Lin Shi thought for a moment and it seemed that Mary would soon become a genius magician who would crush the young masters and ladies of the Stephen family, following the usual routine. However, at this moment, a figure suddenly appeared driving a flying carpet near the two of them, but it was the sixth butler Joseph. Mary quickly lowered her head and said, "Lord Joseph." Joseph waved his hand and said, "I heard that the Magician's District plans to summon you to become a senior maid." Lin Shi said, "Yes." Joseph said, "I will tell their steward that you don't need to go tomorrow." Upon hearing these words, Mary couldn't help but be taken aback. Lin Shi quickly said, "Wait a minute, Mary really hopes to become a magician, but I don't mind." Joseph couldn't help but raise his thick eyebrows and glanced at Lin Shi, saying, "No, you two are very capable maids in the Magic Queen District. There are other tasks for you next, go ahead." Lin Shi couldn't help but say, "Can't Mary go to the Magician's District?" Joseph said coldly, "Pay attention to your tone, maid." Lin Shi had to say, "I'm sorry, Lord Joseph." Mary remained calm and completed the day's maid work, but as soon as she returned to the dormitory, she crawled into her pillow and started crying. Claire and others couldn't help but curiously inquire about what had happened, but Lin Shi wiped away his sweat and was speechless. In the middle of the night, Xiao Kuang suddenly said, "Are you planning to teach her some magic knowledge?" Lin Shi wiped her sweat and said, "Do you really want me to become her best friend?" Xiao Kuai laughed and said, "No, if you teach her magic knowledge, she will transform from a best friend to an old grandfather. It's also very safe." Lin Shi said slowly, "I have indeed sent grandpas to many people, but they are all masters who shake hands. I don't think this seems good, and I don't know what those kids have become now. What if it turns into a demon? So it's better to teach with your own hands. For example, purple steel has obviously become more skilled." Xiao Kuang said angrily, "It seems that you haven't taught Zigong much by yourself, have you? And I think Zigong is just obedient and doesn't have many skills." Lin Shi couldn't help but chuckle and say, "Do you want Zigong to become a master of refining weapons in an instant? And his current level of alchemy is not too weak, okay? And this Mary is different. The more I interact with her, the greater the risk of exposing my identity. Moreover, today I heard Joseph's suggestion that she cannot go to the Demon Lord's area alone. I estimate that if he only stops me, it will arouse suspicion from other members of the Stephen family." Xiao Kuang couldn't help but say, "Do you have the heart to let a protagonist just be a maid like this?" Lin Shi said, "I reckon she has other opportunities to learn magic, and isn't the female lead's novel usually the end of marrying the young master? For example, what Donna Morgan said today about young Master Charles, usually the story ends perfectly when the female lead and such a male lead are together. Xiao Kuang chuckled and said, the premise for her to marry the young master of the Stephen family is to have a magical knowledge and a magical cultivation. Upon hearing this, Lin Shi couldn't help but think of the previous plan of the Magic Association for Zhou Tianxin. Due to Zhou Tianxin's exceptional magical abilities, she was fiercely sought after by many Magic Alliance families. Of course, the purpose was only to make her a production machine that gave birth to high-quality magical offspring. Lin Shi considered for a while and decided to take some time tomorrow to ask Mary about her thoughts. After all, even if it were to become the production machine of the Stephen family, Mary could still live the luxurious life of a young lady in a big family. However, the next day's Queen of Magic District was very busy, and Lin Shi received 3 times more work than yesterday, so she had no chance to talk to Mary at all. After returning to the dormitory, Claire and the others chattered incessantly, and Lin Shi couldn't find a chance to talk to Mary. It seems that we can only wait for Mary to tidy up the dormitory for the others. On the 3rd morning, Lin Zite decided to stay behind and tidy up the dormitory. Then he asked, Mary, do you want to learn magic? Mary said lightly, you don't have to say, Linda, it was an endless dream. Thank you for helping me tidy up the room. She gave Lin Shi a sweet smile. Xiao Kuang said in Lin Shi's mind, Master, as the man with the most hair from the multiverse, what grandpa are you planning to give Mary this time? Lin Shi wiped his sweat and said, is your previous statement valid? As for what grandpa to give her, I haven't figured it out yet. This time, it's different from before. You have to risk exposing my identity, young man. After the maids gathered, the maidservant once again asked Lin Shi and Mary to stay and said, the opportunity to become a senior maid has been wasted by you, but it's okay. Today, you will go take care of Miss Anna in our district. Don't blame me for not reminding you too. I may not be able to win that living ancestor, so take care of yourself. Lin Shi and Mary exchanged a glance and said, yes.